everyone. My name is Kyle Mordock, and I would like to welcome you to this Elemental Insights webinar, The Future of Media Delivery, featuring special guests from Dolby, Verimatrix, and VisualOn. First, a few housekeeping notes. We are recording this webinar, and you will receive an email with a link to the on-demand archive shortly after the event. If you're viewing this on a PC, you will find a button below the player window to submit a question. This will open a new window and will not interrupt your live stream. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. Today, our moderator is Keith Wimes, Vice President of Marketing at Elemental. Our panelists are J.C. Morizer, Senior Director, Professional Solutions and Products at Dolby, Steve Christian, Vice President of Marketing at Verimatrix, and Deepak Das, Senior Director of Marketing at VisualOn. The live stream of this webinar is powered by Elemental Live. Without further ado, here is Keith Wimes.
Thanks, Kyle. And thanks everyone for joining us today on our third live streaming webinar. We're going to talk about the future of media delivery today, and we're really happy that you've joined us. And I also want to thank all of our partners that have joined us here in Portland, Oregon for this live streaming event as well. We've got an interesting dialogue. We're not going to send a lot of PowerPoints your way. Typically when you do a webinar, it tends to be 30 or 40 or 50 PowerPoints and get through them in an hour. We do have a number of those, but in general, we're going to have a dialogue. We're going to talk about a little bit of the context in terms of the delivery of video and media in general, as well as more about the future of video. And we have three experts here. And so I thought the first thing that I would do is have them introduce themselves and their companies, give a little bit of context. Then we'll jump into a little bit of a look back in terms of how we got to this point in time in the industry. And then we'll spend the remainder of the time talking about some elements of the future. In that discussion, during that time, if you have ideas or questions that you want to throw out to us, please do so. We will leave time at the end to do a live Q&A. We won't have seen any of these questions, so it should make for an interesting panel discussion. And I've encouraged all the panelists to feel free to ask questions of the others as well. We do have some questions that we've talked about in terms of having a discussion, but we really do want this to be an open discussion, and hopefully it'll provide some more insights. That's the whole purpose of Elemental Insights webinars. So at this point, I'd like each of the panelists to just take a moment to introduce themselves and give some context in terms of their role and their company's role within the industry. And we'll start with JC from Dolby.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. Very excited to be here. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. J.C. Morizer, driving product and solutions at Dolby. A quick overview of Dolby. We create video, audio, and voice technologies that are essential elements to the best entertainment experiences. We've been in business for a little over 50 years. Some of the marquee groundbreaking innovation we brought to the market were 5.1 surround sound to the theater and to the home. A bit of context.
And Steve?
Yes, thanks, Keith. I'm Steve Christian. I run the marketing and product strategy team at Verimatrix. Verimatrix is a specialist in the protection of revenue streams for pay TV operators around the world. We have about 650 customers today, and it's growing pretty rapidly. We're a pretty young company, about 2000, formed in 2000, so that's relatively young in this space. But it's a significant business and a growing business as we expand across multiple screens, as we're going to be talking about today. Personally, I've been in the pay TV business for about 20 years, I think, about 7 years at Verimatrix as it grows.
And Deepak from VisualOn.
Thank you. Keith, first of all, I want to thank you and Elemental on behalf of the entire panel for having us here and hosting this webinar and making us part of this experience. It's great. Thanks again. My name is Deepak Das, and I'm the Senior Director of Marketing at VisualOn. VisualOn is a software multimedia framework company, and our expertise is in the area of players. We're a relatively younger company than Verimatrix, and we're about 10 years old now. We're about 100 people and growing, and we are in the business of helping companies in the content space overcome the issue of fragmentation as it comes to deployment of all their streaming services over the top.
Great. And for those that aren't familiar, I'm Keith Wimes with Elemental Technologies. I guess we're the baby of the group. We're the second grader. We just turned 7 2 weeks ago, I believe. And we are a video processing software vendor within the multi-screen encoding space and quickly evolving to more of a broadcast level as well. And so that's the context. I think most people in the audience are familiar with Elemental, but I thought I'd give a little bit of that context. What I wanted to do before we get into some of the specific Q&As is to actually take what these guys have said and put it into a little bit of context in terms of the flow of media through the ecosystem. And so you can see where we all reside to give a little context, I guess, to the answers that we'll provide and some of the comments that we'll provide during the course of the webinar. If you're thinking about video getting to an end user, it obviously starts with a source. And on the slide here, you can see a typical source. It may be a camera. It could be a file. It could be a storage system. Or it could just be coming off a satellite, a live linear feed as well. Typically, that goes into a head-end processing. And this is an area that's very complex in terms of its technology. There's encoding that is done to compress the video down to specific bit rates. In the case of multi-screen delivery, it'll be multiple renditions of that content. The content also has to go through audio processing, so that's why we invited Dolby here. We talk about media and video from an elemental perspective is always very important, but the audio is just as important and maybe in some cases more so, and so we'll talk about some of those issues. And then obviously the content needs to be protected, and so that's where Verimatrix comes in terms of content protection, ensuring that you can monetize that content, because once it gets out in the wild and is maybe freely available, it's a little bit more difficult to monetize it. And then it goes downstream, and we're obviously oversimplifying this, but in general, you're going to be distributing in the new world, in the multi-screen world, to a CDN or through a CDN. There's lots of complexities to that typical architecture. We won't go into that in this case. We are streaming today over a CDN. We're using our partner Akamai for the streaming of this event, but we'll have a simple logo there for the CDN portion of the media delivery. And then there's obviously the playback. So once it arrives with the consumer, whether they be in their home or out and about on a Wi-Fi network or potentially over a 4G network, there's the playback, and that's where VisualOn, as well as Verimatrix and Dolby, comes into play, because they all have elements of their solution that fit into the client architecture and the client playback devices, so that in the end, it can get to end users, whether they be on TVs or new OTT set-top boxes, the IP-based set-top boxes like Roku and Xbox and whatnot, as well as tablets and mobile devices, smart TVs. And so that's the context of the workflow. I think most people are familiar with that overall workflow, but I wanted to make sure that each of the participants here was put in context, because I think some of the answers that you'll provide to the questions will relate back to this, and it'll help the audience better understand some of the answers. So at this point, what I wanted to do to kind of open things up is look back a little bit. Dolby's got 50 years of history, Verimatrix about a dozen or a little bit more, and then VisualOn about a decade's worth of experience. And each of you have broad experience in the industry. And what I wanted to do is provide the audience with how did we get to this point in time, so that we have a little bit of context in terms of the innovation that's gone on over the last decade or so. I think we can constrain it perhaps to, or maybe in Dolby's case, we'll go back a little bit more.
Yes.
But let's just talk about that from each of your perspectives. I'll talk a little bit on the elemental perspective, and then we'll get into more of the future of media delivery. So, I'll go in order this time, but I don't propose that I'll do that each time. I will do some surprises probably and mix it up a little bit. So.
Well, if you consider audio in the broad context of multi-screen delivery and kind of like try to establish, the reference point where multi-screen needs to be in order to deliver a truly compelling experience. So if you look back, it started, obviously with stereo content. Then most of really groundbreaking audio innovation were born out of movie theaters, coming out of Hollywood, the content creation community. As a quick digression here, if you talk to the content creators, they'll tell you that sound is half of the experience. And I'm sure that, the audience here would contend that this is indeed half of the experience. That was quite
exactly 50%.
Well, I mean, it depends on the content, right?
Okay, yeah.
It depends on the content,
Yeah.
but Hollywood community spend, a fair amount of energy to, put creativity in the content, the entertainment, trying to create that intimate connection with the content in order to lead to success. So starting with stereo, moving to 5.1 out of the movie theaters, then the logical path was to bring that same experience into the home, And then, of course, how do you bring that into a multi-screen environment, whether it's actually a connected device, a portable device, or a connected device like a Blu-ray player, connected TV, or a DMA that is fitting into a 5.1 enable environment. From a purely structural standpoint at the infrastructure level, I would say that audio codec performances and formats tends to follow what's happening in the video space to some degree, providing the same type of improvement as you release new generation of audio codecs. Today we are in the area, and I think it's very important for multi-screen because it wasn't that much of an issue for broadcast delivery. But now we're in the area where you can deliver, very cost-effectively 5.1, super high quality, high fidelity sound at below 200 kilobits per second, or even below 150 kilobits per second.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about that going forward in terms of that combination of reducing the amount of resource that's required to deliver, as well as increasing the perceived quality, or in many cases, it's actual quality of the audio itself.
We'll talk about that. One example, again, sound matters. That in multi-screen delivery, your lowest profile can be a black screen, but guess what? You still have audio. You still have audio because that provides service continuity, right?
Yeah. Okay. And then, Steve, in terms of Verimatrix, you guys cut your teeth really in the IPTV space, in the 2000s. How did that, if you can talk a little bit about some of the experiences that you had during that time and how that, translates into a relevant scenario in terms of, multi-screen and all the changes that have occurred over the last few years.
Yeah, as you say, IPTV is where Verimatrix started its business. But you should set it against the context of pay TV in general, which, and security has always been a part of the pay TV picture in order to be able to extract revenue streams, to be able to turn on, turn off packages and things like that, and be able to report exactly what has been shown to who. So when IPTV started by the telco organizations around the world, delivery of video across DSL lines and things like that was a greenfield space. It was nothing like as occupied as potentially the satellite and cable spaces. But it really was an opportunity to try some new technologies, in particular to try to use the capabilities of IP transmission in order to secure video without the use of smart card technology. So we kind of made a leap into a new type of security paradigm, still delivering to set-top box type devices, but this new type of security paradigm that used a lot of IP-related technology and internet technology. I think that, now becomes even more relevant when we're spreading out across a spectrum of applications where we're seeing our operators, the operator base around the world, combining traditional broadcasting, cable and satellite channels with IP in terms of the hybrid delivery spectrum, and of course the whole multi-screen paradigm is fundamentally based around IP. So the security mechanisms and the security issues that we've always had to deal with in traditional and IPTV space now start to become more and more relevant in the multi-screen delivery, particularly as you get higher and higher value of streams. It's early days, for sure. We're interested in how that field matures. In fact, we just did a survey, or sponsored a survey with streamingmedia.com. Might be worth taking a quick look at the results of that, a quick glance. One of the things that stands out in the responses from the business community is the prominence of rights management issues, and particularly rights management across screens. There's many other things that we have to address as an industry in terms of business issues and things like that. We're getting the technology components together. Certainly this panel represents some of the technology advances we've made in that delivery, but some of the business issues still remain. So hopefully that sets it in context.
Yeah, and those content rights issues in the IPTV space were huge at the time, right? Because it was a whole new industry that was starting. The content owners were used to distributing over satellite and cable. But
every change in the industry and new technology, you need to prove its validity to the people who license content. And I think we've overcome that issue. We have a strong brand personally, and I think that the technology has been proven pretty effective. and now we're applying that to the multi-screen delivery.
What, maybe I'm exaggerating, but was it easier this time because you had, as a solution provider, had all that context with those content owners? Easier is probably a bad word, but
from a technical standpoint, I would say it's easier in the sense that some of the principles have been established. But from an actual deployment standpoint, you have many, many more devices to deal with, a great diversity of devices. And of course, the issue that those devices typically are owned by consumers, not owned by the operator.
Right.
But those things are, the challenges that we basically work on every day. That diversity is growing all the time.
Great. Okay. Deepak, can you talk a little bit about just the player side of this equation and how, going back 10 years ago, I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of change and fragmentation and consolidation and fragmentation again. Can you talk a little bit about that perspective? Absolutely.
I mean, in 10 short years, with the emergence of devices like smartphones and tablets, we have seen a significant shift in the way video is consumed. It's almost, in fact, as if mobile has become the medium of first consumption, and every other device has become secondary. VisualOn was started with our core expertise was in the area of software codecs initially. About 10 years ago when we started, we were supplying to the device manufacturers in the ODM space. Slowly over time, with the emergence of tablets and smartphones and video consumption on these devices, we've seen a demand perk up for more than just the codec side of the expertise. We've actually seen a demand for addressing how to deal with fragmentation in this space. There's an intense fragmentation, not in just terms of devices, but form factors, OSs, and also in terms of the streaming protocols and file formats that each of these devices supports. So as a content provider, these content providers have significant challenges in being able to target each and every end device. So it becomes imperative on them to find a model that's scalable for them, and therein lies the software framework which enables content delivery across a wide set of connected devices. And to be able to do that, you have to have a solid understanding of what it takes to target a player across each of these device platforms and be able to effectively deliver content across to these devices.
Was there any analogy or any previous technology, and maybe it's in the set-top box space, where you could see that some historical experience in that area of dealing with perhaps different silicon or different set-top boxes was helpful, or where did VisualOn get the core competence?
I think initially when we started, we were in, our expertise was in being able to deploy software codecs and that was optimized to certain specific CPU chipsets or devices. But what we started seeing is with the emergence of the iOS and Android devices, especially Android, and with manufacturers making their own flavors of Android and adopting Android and then slightly changing them, it becomes a little bit more difficult to be able to address and target each of these devices. So I think this fragmentation is a new thing, especially in this space, from a media delivery perspective, and it's only going to increase, and it's not going to decrease.
Okay, great. So what I wanted to do is just wrap up this section with a slide here, and it's a data point that is out there from the Diffusion Group, and it kind of shows, at a very macro level, from an end user perspective, how much time they spend watching, live broadcast TV versus essentially internet video, and that includes OTT and TV everywhere types of applications. And this was done a few years ago, but I don't think it's actually that far off. The directions are probably pretty close. I don't know if the crossover point is accurate or.
It's a pretty provocative.
Yeah, it's got some issues. It's definitely got some issues with it, and we're going to talk to some of these things, I think. But the key point is we've been talking a little bit about the history in the last 10 years and all the change that's happened in the last 3 or 4. And while everyone feels the effects of internet video and internet delivered video, I guess more accurately, and media, we're really still early days, right? We're still figuring things out, and it's where thought leaders and market leaders come together to try to solve some of the problems that are out there, because there's a tremendous amount of disruption going on. And I won't use some of the words that we hear all the time on panels in terms of companies that are doing that disruption. But I think we can all agree, and perhaps the audience agrees, that at least these slopes are directionally correct. Whether or not the market feels flat overall or not, I don't think that's really the intent of the chart that TDG put together. But in general, and if anyone has any thoughts about this, I'm happy to hear it.
It seems to be the case that overall consumption is actually on the rise, and
because we have so much more time.
We have so much more time. That's right. Or maybe we just have eyeballs divided between multiple screens, which are being used simultaneously, which is one theory.
Yeah.
But one of the things I find interesting about prognostications of disaster and doom and gloom in the traditional video industry is, I suppose, which this particular slide and this curve attempts to kind of illustrate. I find it interesting that that against that background of overall increased consumption, there seems to be a great opportunity for even the traditional players to be able to take on board a different delivery strategy and still be king of the hill in terms of the service they're delivering to consumers.
Right. And that,
So
go ahead.
my take on that slide is, the general direction might be right, but in order for that crossover to really take place, a couple of things will need to happen, and one of them is really about capturing the eyeballs and keeping them. And part of it will be, a key element to that equation will be to provide the quality of experience and the quality of service that live broadcast TV delivers today. I mean, this is rock solid, 5 nines availability. You don't have to worry about whether you're going to get the channel or not. The video quality is great in the most part. Of course, the sound quality is also very important, a key element of that experience. So, frankly, for IP, delivery OTT to get to that level of wide acceptance in the marketplace, they're really going to have to think long and hard about the quality of experience. Of course, content is king. And for that as well to realize itself well, they're only going to be able to get to that level if they manage not only to keep the eyeballs, but to attract the ad ecosystem to go and spend money in that particular new delivery medium. And the fragmentation, as you implied, Deepak, is a challenging, a mangus pain in the tail for all the players involved in that space.
And to speak to this slide, I wouldn't necessarily view this as negative, because I think for the industry overall, it's a positive shift because it represents the even more devices and even more endpoints. So the key question remains as to how industries will monetize it. I mean, if you look at some of the key success factors that will enable the next generation of content providers, is the ability to target end user devices, ability to have access to rich media content or original programming. Having a large subscriber base, and then having an existing business relationship. These are the 4 key factors that will drive, and there are very few players in the industry who have all of these and have access to some of those. So if they can manage those assets properly, I think they will be successful, and that will determine how they're going to succeed in this place.
Right. I think it's the classic innovator's dilemma, right? We're actually seeing this. We've probably all read the book by Clay Christensen. And there's some nice anecdotes in there, but it's really interesting from an industry standpoint, being in this industry, to actually see it happening, right? And you see it via, what used to be user-generated content and lots of cats that people were interested in, and now you can really get a sense that the perceived quality levels and actual quality levels of that content is raising the value of the content. And Steve, a question for you is, once you have that, you need to be sure that you protect it, and how does that impact the industry?
Yeah, when you're using internet delivered video as a direct substitute for broadcast delivered video, all of the considerations that JC mentioned about reliability of the back end systems and things like that, but also reliability of the streams, and reliability of the streams in the sense of the presentation of the streams without jitter or stalls or anything like that. That becomes vitally important as well, because people rely on it. One of the things that I find interesting about those kinds of slides is a presumption, or at least some people's presumption, that live linear TV, live events and things like that becomes less and less important as you have more and more on-demand content. more and more personalized delivery and things like that. And
Right.
I tend to think the balance in that picture is actually a little, the way that sort of presumption of live broadcast going out of fashion, I think that's a little overstated.
And you're saying that beyond sports?
I think, well, sports, reality TV, even social TV. I mean, social TV really only works properly in a linear delivery format, right?
Right.
So there's quite a bit of live content that still brings people around the water cooler, even the virtual water cooler, if you like. So.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier it's about creating an environment that taps into the human emotions, because that's really what happens when you watch TV, whether it's sports content or movie material. And so I agree with Steve, live linear broadcast, specific for sport, which is for the most part a very social event. When you think about it, you're sitting with your buddies watching the game, is not going away.
Yeah. I mean, so when we talk about media in general, or at least from an elemental perspective, we tend to really focus on the video. And I guess my question is, when you talk about the increasing, one of the big trends I think in media delivery is really that people are expecting more and more in terms of quality. Is that true on the audio side too, or is there kind of a ceiling where it's good enough? What are people's?
Well, people don't know what they don't know, right? And it's only when you expose them to what they could possibly get and how much better it could be that they truly realize, what I really want this. And I think we can see on the slide here that, yes, consumers do care about audio. According to research from Park Associate, 50% of consumers in the U.S. Consider audio quality, audio experience as being a very important criteria in their purchase decision. So they do care about audio. Going back to the fragmented ecosystem, if you compare to broadcast, closed, controlled environment, usually playing back on a home theater or speaker bars or decently high quality speakers on the TV. Once you move in multi-screen, it's the Wild West, and they lose control of that quality of experience on the playback. And that's where companies like Dolby bring our experience in that space and say, what is it that we can do to truly enhance the playback experience, make it more immersive, even if it's a stereo playback device. We leverage the 5.1 surround track to alleviate some of the consumer complaint. One of them will be, I can't hear the dialogue on my tablet. I'm watching whatever content, I just can't hear it, even on the headphones. Or when I play back on the speaker, it's widely distorted. So our technology, the Digital Plus, includes a very sophisticated set of post-processing function, playback function, that actually alleviate all those issues and truly bring a more immersive, more real, if you would, experience like the one you would get in the movie theater, literally, or on your home theater. Data points. I mean, well, that's you can see down the slide, and one of the proof points we like to use is, last fall Amazon actually launched their Kindle Fire HD, and they designed that Dolby technology in their product, and actually used the audio quality as one of the 3 pillars of their direct-to-consumer messaging. And the feedback, provided by consumer was extremely, extremely positive, at least on the audio side.
Can you envision a time when it gets so good or it's so differentiated that beyond the premium that a consumer would pay on the playback device, that you would actually have a tier of service, similar to SD versus HD, where people are willing to pay maybe a few dollars more a month? Do you think that could be true on the audio side, or would it need to be bundled as an overall media offer where it includes some enhancements to video? And we'll talk a little bit about 4K in a few minutes, but do you think that's even possible in the audio world?
That's a great question. Traditionally, it's been bundled with an overall entertainment experience that encompasses a better audio experience. So the opportunity would lie into that next generation entertainment experience that we're going to be talking about, I think, and assuming later on in that discussion.
Okay.
But most definitely, consumer recognize that if it sounds better, then they'll be more attracted to the content.
That kind of home theater premium packaging has been used, I think, pretty effectively in the pay TV world. So that's I think very definite possibility for development of the OTT industry in the future. And if you combine that with different release windows and things like that, I think it becomes part of a very interesting set of offers that can be made as in conjunction with the different forms of content and the ways that you can navigate that content and you know, the overall value proposition of the services.
Okay. And then in terms of, for Deepak, you know, increasing the quality level, obviously on the player side, that's the point of no return, right? If it's not
Right.
if it's not looking good at that point, if it hasn't been properly constructed, there's going to be a challenge. And I know
Right.
it's a very complex environment.
Well, I mean, if we take a quick look at the slide, you know, you'll notice that, you know, there's a reasonable amount of complexity in being able to build a multimedia player, and, you know, you can't take things for granted. You know, when you look at the end-to-end ecosystem of being able to deliver a streaming service over, you know, OTT, or being able to deliver to your end devices, you got to look at the various complexities involved in building a player. I mean, obviously there's device, OS, you know, differences, chipset requirements, and various form factors and so on. And then there's an application level complexity that you need to worry about how you're going to sort of create your floor plan and being able to provide the best user experience to your end user, because that's where the most important exchange is happening. That's where the brand that you represent is being exchanged with the end consumer. But underneath that one level, the content providers have more complexities to deal with in terms of determining which is the best streaming protocol, which is the best file format to support for that particular device. And obviously they have some legacy issues because they already have assets potentially in one or the other format that they have to deliver, and the device may or may not support those formats. So they have to worry about how they're going to contend with that, whether they're going to create additional headaches of creating additional video assets on the back end, or they're going to be able to control that from a client side perspective. And then there's obviously the issues of DRM. Based on the DRM that you choose on the back end, now you have to be able to plug in and work with that DRM on the client side as well and represent that level of protection, especially as more and more content is becoming HD. It becomes imperative that there be a level of control over that. And then there's other issues such as closed captioning with like CEA 608,
Those are
708
issues?
formats in the United States, which are different than
Yeah.
expectations in Europe and other geographies as well.
It's part of a complete service,
right?
I mean, it's just part of the
Right.
the expected overall presentation.
Right. So they can't think about this in the vacuum of, okay, I'm just going to send this content out and it's going to play back on the device. That's not the level of complexity. There's a lot more thing to having a complete offering,
Yep.
especially as you start rolling into monetization, where it involves analytics and potentially ad insertion and other non-subscription based services as well.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I guess one question I have for you is, you know, because you're on the player side, you have a unique view, I think, in terms of the devices that are utilized to view the video. Do you see any type of gravity or consolidation happening where, and it may be even at a macro level of tablets versus PCs and laptops, like do you actually see trends that suggest that things are starting to simplify a little bit, or is the window still widening and becoming more complex?
I think the window is still widening. There are additional complexities in terms of especially as we transition from H.264 into H.265 at HEVC, how are those going to be able to be supported? There's going to be issues with respect to hardware unavailability for a year or two, and then how are you going to be able to support the transition in a software format? With the rise of dual-core and quad-core processors and the ability to have GPU chipsets on those, you have to worry about how you're going to be able to leverage hardware acceleration on some devices that are capable of doing that and not on the others which don't have that capability. So from a content perspective, content providers have to worry about all of these when they are thinking of planning to deploy playback on these devices, because without it, they will not have uniform and good quality playback on all the devices.
Right, and that's a good transition. We haven't mentioned HEVC yet. This is an area that's near and dear to Elemental's heart. Obviously, we believe we have one of the most progressive solutions in this area. We're quite far ahead in terms of our development of our codec, and this is a slide that obviously shows the traditional drop in bit rate that can be achieved with advances in compression, and it really derives from the advances in the underlying silicon and chipsets and the computational power that's existing in solutions today. And so one question I had, I think this is an example of a technology that can enable higher qualities, right? Because you're able to do that over bandwidth constrained networks. If you're able to reduce the bit rate by upwards of 50%. We're getting to that point now at Elemental. It's really extraordinary in terms of how fast this is happening, especially when compared to the previous shift from MPEG-2 to H.264. I think this is an area that can help drive, and we'll talk a little bit about higher resolutions, obviously, but even at a constant resolution, you're able to reduce those bit rates so that the quality of experience for the end user when they're on bandwidth-constrained networks
Even mobile networks, for instance. right?
even all the way down to mobile, and it can really open up the industry as well in terms of most of the bits that are delivered for OTT or TV everywhere types of applications are charged by the bit, right, by the CDN, and so that's a huge operational expense. I wanted to ask you, Deepak, not to hit you twice, but you mentioned there are some challenges in terms of HEVC adoption, but are we getting closer in terms of having a viable?
Right, sorry. So we haven't seen any commercial deployments yet. So they're all in field testing right now, and we're working with a lot of potential customers to have their deployments out on HEVC. But I think the challenges come from being able to nail down the spec, having a player that supports the spec, having an encoder that supports the spec, and having all of this work together from the encoder, the DRM integration to the CDNs to the player, and any other additional post-processing capabilities, whether it's audio or video, all inserted into this and having it play. I mean, if it's Dolby, it's got to be in there, and if it's some sort of closed captioning, it has to be in there as well. So I think this calls for a level of interoperability that companies need to be able to work together to nail this flow right, and it's key to the success of any HEVC deployments and accelerate that. Actually, one of the things that I think that may happen is that as you know, I think there was a Cisco study out that said that mobile video would actually increase 66 to 70% by 2017. So if you see that trend, maybe there's potentially for those networks, wireless networks, to leapfrog and adopt HEVC first, as opposed to the traditional OTT and other players adopting it first. So it remains to be seen, but it's a possibility that they.
Yeah, I think there are countries out there which probably wired broadband will be a less significant part of the picture than wireless broadband. When I say wireless, I mean mobile, right? Cellular.
Yeah.
And this type of technology, the bandwidth efficiencies and things like that, will enable those wireless networks to really shine in terms of capabilities, either in conjunction with the traditional broadcast mediums or as standalone OTT services. And so that's where we see, the experience in the US and Western Europe, for instance, starting to transfer into places like India and Latin America.
Yeah, we had a customer forum, an executive forum last month at Elemental, where we brought in 25 or so thought leaders from our customer base, and we asked them, to try to give a feel for HEVC and whether or not, what their predictions were in terms of when it would happen, and a couple of them thought that it was actually going to happen faster than some of the industry pundits have mentioned. We're at the point now of starting to see, beyond player decoding, some hardware-based decoding of HEVC, and that's obviously a big factor as well. But on the audio side, when you talk about maintaining quality of experience and higher resolutions and higher definition, how do you deal with that on the Dolby side? Because the audio portion also provides opportunities.
If we go back to Deepak's slide, I think that speaks volume, no pun intended, about the complexity of the multi-screen ecosystem. And when you look at when the industry started to launch those multi-screen services, really they didn't give much thought about audio, and I think rightfully so, given the variable in place and the complexities they had to deal with. By and large, the industry is moving forward, and Deepak, you said, starting to really get their arms around, tackling and blocking those issues. So we believe that it's time for, the industry, the multi-screen industry, whether it's OTT online or traditional pay TV delivering multi-screen services, to how can we bring the quality of experience to the next level? And going back to what we said about consumers, how they value audio, how the content creation community value audio, the bar that has been set by broadcast, pay TV, satellite, IPTV, whatever, a broadcast delivery medium there is. So yes, to answer your question, we have solutions that allow us to actually mesh the highest level of audio quality into a multi-screen environment, which is using, as you know, adaptive bitrate switching.
Yep.
So the whole industry defaulted.
Do you want to actually show an example of that?
An example of that. So most of the service that you'll find on air, and I'll talk about a few exceptions, some leaders in the industry in terms of service, defaulted to stereo at 64 kilobits, even for super high quality HD content. Now, with our technology, you can actually deliver 5.1 at 192 kilobits that you can attach to the highest video quality ladder. And then you can create lower profiles of audio as well, going down to stereo or even mono, allows you to create that continuity in the quality of experience, quality of service, as you have to deal with the bandwidth being constrained in the home for whatever reason.
So the audio is actually adaptive in this way.
The audio is completely adaptive, switches bitrate and channel configuration, which actually also enable the path to monetization for ad insertion. Advertisement, at least in the broadcast world, when you cut from a network to an ad, if the audio switching is not seamless, it is not considered as being an ad success, so therefore you don't collect the money.
Yeah.
Right, going about 5.1 and the thought leaders, you got the leading OTT services in the US, whether it's Netflix, Vudu, HBO Go, they all made their service available with 5.1 surround sound because they recognize that that's one way to really up-level their value proposition to consumers.
Yeah, and then at the same time, we have a demonstration of just the reduction in bit rate that can be achieved on the video side with HEVC. So we have a player with VisualOn. Can also be encrypted with Verimatrix, and although it's always funny to do a demonstration of scrambling, right? It's not that.
Well, we're all
not that
involved
interesting.
in standards, emerging standards like MPEG-Dash, of course.
Yeah.
And it does enable a lot of these kind of sophisticated capabilities, right?
Correct.
It enables the multiple audio capabilities, enables the seamless switching of bit rates better. There's a number of things. It's it's something that we're all involved in.
So I know we have about 20 minutes or so left. I wanted to get into a little discussion of monetization, and then we'll go over to a Q&A from the audience. I assume that there are questions in the audience, assuming people are listening and watching. There may be 100 of them, so it could be an interesting session. But I do want to talk a little bit about monetization, and we have basically a slide up here, a chart from eMarketer that basically is showing a little bit similar to the previous chart that we showed with the difference in slope of traditional TV viewing and internet video viewing. Really the monetization element of video today is entirely in the traditional world. If you look at TV monetization in the U.S., 60 to 65 billion dollars. On the digital side, it is still quite small, despite the fact that the viewing on that content is growing very, very quickly. And so I think in terms of the industry, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been proving out technical capability, the ability to scale. And I think for a lot of people, what started out as a smaller test has now really come to flow in terms of making sure that the revenue's flowing. And how do you monetize? And this is not just a science experiment. It's actually a real business, and we're under threat, and we have opportunity. So I'm interested in terms of, Deepak, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the elements of monetization and the analytics that you provide on the player side, and how do we get there? How do we get beyond being less than a tenth of the total budget in terms of ad spending?
Right. So I just brought with me here a sample clip that we have that shows an overlay of some of the analytics we capture. And the analytics is a broad space. I mean, there's player-based, there's player analytics, there's device analytics, there's network, data that you can capture, and also in terms of what the device is able to handle as well, right? So I hope you got that. So in terms of the analytics is very key and tied into the whole monetization strategy. I mean, in there are two modes of analytics. In the pre-deployment mode, analytics that are player analytics, and can actually help you fine-tune your delivery and be able to set up your whole end-to-end infrastructure and be able to give the appropriate feedback so that you can set the encoding parameters, make adjustments, and have a great flow before you actually deploy and go to scale. And then in post-deployment, the analytics turns more towards the usage. What's the customer or what's the end user doing? Is he pausing at a certain point? Is he playing it? Is he rewinding? Or other aspects of the user behavior is captured and then fed back. And those can be aggregated to be able to provide you information that you can then use to either drive some kind of capability towards being able to target that particular individual or the user with certain services or other programming and things like that. So analytics is a key piece, and it's definitely tied into the whole monetization strategy along with ad insertion.
Yeah.
The complexity that ad insertion brings to the whole player issue is that you just have to worry about how smart the player is in terms of being able to pause at a certain point, pick up the ad stream, whether it's from the same stream or whether it's coming from a different server, and then be able to play that back and then seamlessly switch back.
And from a user experience perspective, and this is for any of you that want to comment, I've heard from some customers that the end user has actually been a little bit conditioned over the last 3 or 4 years to not expect to have ads. There's been enough content that is void of ads, or people are getting used to subscription models. Do we think we need to break through that? Do we think that's true? I mean, I've heard it from a number of them where as they've gone to try to monetize more with pre-roll and mid-roll and post-roll, that it's becoming a kind of a customer detractor, and they're starting to complain about it.
I don't know. I don't necessarily want to be too philosophical. I mean, ad revenue is clearly a very important driver of our industry as a whole, but certainly the packaging of basically subscription VOD that we see in some of the OTT services, highly personalized and highly, your ability to be able to browse through different titles and different content, things like that. Adverts get in the way of that for sure, and so the subscription model becomes potentially a very important kind of aspect of some of these new services, and I think we're seeing the success of that in different places around the world.
Don't you think as well that multi-screen delivery offers to some degree a unique opportunity for service providers and ad agency, in the sense that you can technically, correct me if I'm wrong here, you can actually achieve reach the holy grail of advertisement, which is truly personalized advertisement, because it's a unicast session, who's watching, what they're watching.
That's true, but I've had many experiences recently where the personalization is certainly very substandard. So I think personalization is a holy grail that has been chased for many, many years and is still found wanting. So it can be, the consumer at the end of the day will choose whether they want to have services which are subsidized by advertising, or whether they want to pay a little bit more and have services that are effectively advert free.
Sure.
And when you see people doing things like binge viewing of a series of programs and things like that, I mean that's all that kind of experience really it tells you that people want that kind of uninterrupted consumption experience that those kinds of services can give you.
Deepak, closing word
Well,
on
I wanted to
monetization?
say that there's very few companies that have proven successful with the OTT subscription model to date. And that's because, like I said before, the key factors that helped them get there was that they had the ability to target those devices, or had the resources to be able to do that, have access to content, have a large enough subscriber base to be able to get that kind of return on investment, and then have an existing business relationship with the consumer. I mean, unless all of these four fall together and make work together, they're not going to be successful. So potentially for a lot of the other OTT players, ad insertion or other unique methods of ad delivery is the only way they can actually monetize this content. So they have to look at other means and avenues.
There isn't going to be one way that dominates.
Right.
It's most likely.
Yeah.
So I know we wanted to talk a little bit about virtualization and cloud and that impact in terms of the future, and we're going to skip over that. I hope there's some questions from the audience in terms of virtualization and how that would impact the future of media, and we can maybe do it in the Q&A, but we have a few minutes left. What I wanted to do at this point was go back to Kyle, who introduced the session, and he's been looking through a lot of the questions that have been coming in from the audience. I have no idea what they are, so we'll see what he throws at us. And feel free to decline if there's anything that's too controversial, or in the case of a larger public company, maybe you can't comment on. But we'll see what is out there in terms of the audience. And you also have some housekeeping issues, Kyle, I think that you want to talk about.
Thanks, Keith. Before we jump into Q&A, I want to remind everyone that you will receive an email with a link to the archived recording of this webinar shortly after the event. Okay, let's take a few questions. Keith, our first question from the audience is, how do you see telco operators like AT&T playing in the CDN space with regard to streaming video to mobile devices?
I think that's an interesting question. I don't know that we necessarily want to point out a certain service provider, but in terms of the panel here, how, obviously telcos, a lot of deep expertise, a lot of legacy over typically 100 years in terms of networking. How do we see them playing in the CDN space? From my perspective, what I see, especially at the top end of the market, is that they've all deployed CDNs internally. They typically will.
Verizon deployed their own system as well.
As they own, a large part of the last mile, obviously it is an extension of that privileged delivery pipe, right? So that's absolutely key. So.
Yeah, and I tend to think that they use a combination, right? They will use a services-based approach when it makes sense. That may be in certain geographies where they don't have that network available.
Yes,
but in network, they're going to have, they're going to want to offload that kind of cost structure and infrastructure.
Pricing is going to become key, whether they can be competitive to the pricing demands of the new entrants into the OTT space to be able to provide the CDN services that they can deploy and get their money back on those services. So I think pricing becomes key. If they overprice themselves or if they price themselves out of the market, I'm sure there'll be other players who will come in and grab that market.
Okay. As an overlay to that question, this one might be a little contentious, but I'm going to go there anyway. Netflix has their Open Connect CDN solution. Any of the customers that you're dealing with, you don't have to name them obviously, but do we think that's been adopted? I've kind of heard that most ISPs are not as interested in having someone else be controlling some of the bits that are going through their network, but I don't know if you guys have seen anything different. It's something that...
Well, at a broad level, what we have seen is some of those OTT service providers actually leveraging multiple CDNs, and the main reason for that is not necessarily cost-driven. It is always cost-driven, but it's really quality of experience-driven. So they'll connect whoever you are, they'll connect you to the right CDN, because they know they can provide the highest quality of experience, the highest quality of service. So maybe you'll get through your content through Level 3 or Akamai or Limelight, or maybe someone else, Verizon, depending on where you sit, in the distribution network as a consumer.
Okay. Kyle, do we have another question?
We do. Next question is, will HEVC be the primary market driver for lowering bandwidth for network efficiency, or instead for increasing video quality for 4K?
For 4K in particular. So that's a good question. I'll open it up to the group if they want to answer it. It's a bit of a video compression question, I guess. But there's always that trade-off, right, between increased efficiency in terms of reducing the bit rate of the content versus being able to provide a greater level of experience. Because they qualified that with 4K, it maybe provides the answer. But any comments there?
The return on investment has to be there in terms of, primarily, it's prime for, I would say, a relatively greenfield type of environment for multi-screen, because yes, you can perhaps reach a combination of content delivery cost reduction and increasing the overall user experience. HEVC would arguably allow you as well to reduce the number of profiles that you have, which is creating asset management complexities. When it's purely greenfield, it's always easier to use a new codec, so it's definitely prime for 4K. And the practicality of delivering Ultra HD on an OTT network will, no matter what, anyway drive you to use HEVC. It's not practical to use HEVC over an OTT network.
I think for 4K, it's pretty binary, right?
And plus, existing investments in H.264 infrastructure and other capabilities to deliver on H.264 right now will determine how soon and quickly they adopt to it, or transition over to HEVC. Plus, there's costs involved in moving all the content over to HEVC, or like I said, greenfield, if all the new content is created in HEVC, then there's a transition period in time where they have to potentially support both H.264 and H.265 as the move happens.
Knowing that the OTT space is there and that doing 4K will probably be done in that space, especially because there's no legacy infrastructure with HEVC. When you look at the legacy infrastructure or traditional, let's say the pay TV operators, satellite cable, IPTV or telco TV, do you guys think that history is going to repeat itself in terms of the satellite guys in general in 2004, 5 were some of the first to adopt H.264 because they wanted to transition to HD? Do you think that's going to happen again for 4K, or is that going to be different this time?
Depends on the scale. It depends on the scale. I mean, AVC was adopted, in satellite distribution, direct broadcast satellite, because of course they needed the bandwidth to begin with, and there was the scale. DirecTV pioneered the whole industry in the US by being the first one to provide 200 plus channels to its subscribers. So obviously the bandwidth challenge drove them, and the lack of legacy issues in the field with set-top box made the transition, I would say, accretive to them. By and large, DBS around the world still use MPEG-2 for standard definition. Cable still use MPEG-2 for high definition.
Yep.
So again, those transitions take a long time, but they move faster again if it's a completely greenfield opportunity. It's the same for audio in many ways. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Kyle, next question. We've got time for a couple more, I think.
Question number 3, and this question is actually directed at Deepak. It is known that some consumer devices, for example the Samsung S4, can already perform HEVC decoding with software implemented decoders. How does this affect battery life?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. Most people ask this question, but one of the key things to note is that display is the major consumer of battery. It takes about 70 to 75% of your battery life. So whether it's a hardware codec or a software codec, and with an optimized software codec performance, you can pretty much compete in the same realm as hardware codecs as well, not to that efficiency, but you gotta set aside a major chunk of your battery life towards the display, and that's key and to note. And it's not about the software codec. Secondly, just because there is an implementation of a software codec that's available on the device doesn't necessarily mean that you have a player infrastructure or the framework to be able to harness that. You have to have the player capability to be able to leverage that resource on the device and then be able to build your player framework and then have the appropriate data source module to be able to read that data in and then be able to play back on the device. So those are a couple of key things that you need to be able to think about in terms of deploying on devices that already have a potential HEVC decoder on the device.
And I think we've seen some studies that have been done in terms of the iPad and the reduction of battery life that's associated with HEVC decoding. It is shorter, but it's around 15%. I think there was a lot of discussion in the industry, particularly 6 months ago or a year ago, that suggested that it would be a lot more than that, a lot more challenging. But in fact, some of the studies that have been done are consistent with what you've said in terms of the codec itself on the decode is not what burns through the battery. It doesn't cut it in half or by 75%. It's literally by 15% or so. Next question?
2 more questions, Keith.
2 more? Okay.
How do you feel MPEG- changes the landscape for content delivery going forward? Will it help or hurt the standards fragmentation?
Oh, you're asking about feelings. This is one, obviously, MPEG- we haven't talked too much about. It's a standard that's been put in place to try to solve some of the challenges in terms of fragmentation with smooth streaming and Adobe Dynamic and Apple HLS. It's been supported, obviously, by 2 of those folks and a number of vendors in the industry, and there's been some trials. I know we participated with Elemental in the Olympic trial that was done last year in Belgium for Dash. But you're all involved in some ways here. What is your take on whether it's helping or hurting, or will help or will hurt in the future?
It's still early days, I think, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. Particularly devices such as connected TVs, smart TVs. The challenges of delivering different services to those TVs have become overwhelming, I think. One of the reasons that smart TV adoption, I think, is less pervasive than people expected in the early days. And Dash as a standard helps to kind of unify the delivery of services and, to some extent, the protection of those services to devices like connected TVs. It simplifies the landscape in terms of delivery. But we have to realize that it's going to take quite a long while to transition from where we are to a standard where everything is delivered in that format.
And there's some application level standards, particularly in Europe,
Yeah, well,
in terms of HBB TV.
HEVC TV, which has been primarily designed to bring some consistency.
That references Dash as a standard.
Reference Dash,
Right.
so
Yeah.
it will actually increase adoption rate and attach rate of Dash capable players, at least on connected TVs, right? Because it's mandated by a standard which
Yeah,
is
that's-
enforced.
yeah.
So that's going to help at least to prime the ecosystem as whether service provider will switch overnight to Dash. I think you're right. It's too early to tell, and too early
Well,
to say.
we're-
Maybe Dash for certain devices. I mean, TVs, I think, are going to be a leading element of that kind of adoption curve. Tablets may be, slower. I don't know.
Well, we're all members of the Dash IF group, and we're working towards enabling Dash, so we're all in support of it. And obviously, it's a unifying, factor. So I think we will see deployments. It's just a matter of time before we see them.
Okay,
We're assuming that Dash will be successful.
yeah, I think so. Okay, last question, Kyle.
All right. Last question from the audience is, what data stream are you using? At least one of our viewers says the video looks great.
Oh man, that was a softball.
Yeah.
I don't know what data stream means, but so the question is, what are we using as the source, or what is the CDN? The source is Elemental Live, as we announced earlier. So I'm glad people have commented that it looks good. We always wonder, right? There's a lot of between this room and the user's eyeballs. There's a lot of elements that go into it. So it's nice to hear that feedback back from the audience that it looks good and hopefully sounds good as well, because audio is important.
Better sound good.
So I thought the best way to wrap up was really to talk about the fact that we can't predict what the future is, right? We always try to do that, and you as end users of the systems and industry pundits always try to predict the future. But we don't pretend that we can predict the future. I think we can tell that there are certain trends that happen. But what we do know is that having suppliers in the industry and customers in the industry that are willing to engage and have the best tool sets and the ability to be flexible enough to handle that change, particularly today, whether it be Dash or whether or not it's 4K or HEVC or a number of the adaptive audio standards or content protection, the ability to be nimble and be flexible is really important. And that becomes more important probably over time when you can't predict what's going to happen. Back in the early days, you could probably take a better guess at 5 years out. Today, it's a little bit more challenging, and so you have to have that level of flexibility. So at this point, I want to thank very much the panelists from Dolby and Verimatrix and VisualOn
Thank you.
Thank you.
for joining. And definitely want to thank the audience for listening in on our third webinar. Hopefully you found it insightful. And at this point, I'd like to hand it back to Kyle to close up. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. We look forward to your attendance at future Elemental events and hope to see you at IBC in September. Thanks to our panel, and thank you all for attending this Elemental Insights webinar. This concludes the presentation.